In the summer of 1944, American armor rolled into Western Europe behind a wall of fire and smoke. The land was tight, wet, and hostile. Normandy's hedgerows rose like earthen barricades, each one a hidden firing line. Mud clung to boots and tracks alike. The air smelled of cordite, crushed leaves, and hot oil. For U.S. tank crews, this was not the sweeping maneuver warfare they had trained for. It was close, violent, and unforgiving. The backbone of this advance was the M4 Sherman. Fast, reliable, and mass-produced, it was never meant to duel heavy guns head-on. Its strength was movement, coordination, and relentless pressure. Crews advanced in columns, supporting infantry units armed with M1 Garands and bazookas. Radios crackled constantly, relaying orders, warnings, fragments of fear. A single shouted command could mean survival. A missed signal could mean a burning hull. Every mile forward was paid for in steel and blood. German anti-tank guns were hidden with precision, zeroed on narrow lanes where Shermans were forced to funnel through gaps in the bocage. One shot could kill a tank. 1 second of hesitation could doom a platoon. Tank commanders stood half-exposed in their hatches, binoculars pressed to their eyes, scanning for muzzle flashes or unnatural stillness in the hedges. Their steel helmets were smeared with dust and sweat. Their hands shook, even when discipline held. The American armored doctrine demanded momentum. Stop too long and the enemy adjusted. Move too fast and you outran your infantry. The balance was brutal. Engines roared at full throttle, tracks grinding over stone walls shattered by explosives. The concussion of friendly artillery rolled across the fields like distant thunder. When shells landed short, the earth jumped beneath the tanks, rattling teeth and nerves. Inside the hull, the world was noise and heat. The smell of burned powder hung heavy after every fired round. The loader moved on instinct, slamming shells into the breach. The gunner tracked shadows through a narrow sight. The driver felt the terrain through vibration alone, trusting shouted directions he could barely hear. These men were young, exhausted, and fully aware that armor was not invincibility. It was only a thin barrier between life and obliteration. By late July, as Operation Cobra began to break the stalemate, American tanks surged forward into newly opened ground. Speed returned, but danger multiplied. Mines littered roads. Panzerfaust teams waited in ruins. Air superiority meant nothing at hedge height. Every engagement was a test of nerves and judgment, fought at distances where survival was never guaranteed. This was the environment that shaped impossible decisions. The kind made when retreat promised death and forward movement offered only a slim, brutal chance. And in one shattered field, under relentless fire, an American tank would be pushed beyond doctrine, beyond expectation, and into a moment no manual could explain. By 1944, the turret was the soul of an American tank. It was not just steel and machinery. It was control, vision, and violence bound together. From the rotating turret came the Sherman 75mm gun, its coaxial machine gun, and the commander's view of a battlefield that shifted by the second. Without it, a tank was blind, mute, and dangerously exposed. The turret allowed American armor to fight while moving. It rotated independently from the hull, letting gunners track targets without repositioning the entire vehicle. In the hedgerows of Normandy, that ability meant the difference between reacting in time and dying in place. A hidden anti-tank gun could reveal itself for only a heartbeat. The turret gave crews that heartbeat back. Inside, the turret was cramped and merciless. Steel walls pressed close. Spent shell casings clanged to the floor, rolling under boots slick with oil and sweat. The gunner leaned forward, eye locked to the sight, fingers steady despite the thunder of nearby impacts. The loader worked in near darkness, muscles burning as he wrestled shells from racks bolted into the turret ring. Each round weighed over 30 pounds. Each one mattered. The tank commander stood higher, half exposed, scanning for danger. His hatch was a promise and a threat. From there, he could see infantry signaling, tracer fire ripping across fields, smoke blooming where artillery struck. From there, he could also be hit by shrapnel, bullets, or blast. Still, commanders stayed up. Vision was life. Hesitation was death. American doctrine depended on that turreted firepower. Shermans were not built to absorb punishment like heavier enemy armor. They were built to strike first, suppress, maneuver, and overwhelm through numbers and coordination. Infantry advanced behind them, trusting the turret to clear threats hidden beyond walls and ruins. When the turret spoke, rifles moved forward. Mechanically, the turret was a marvel and a liability. A direct hit could jam its rotation, shatter optics, or kill everyone inside. Ammunition stored nearby turned penetrations into infernos. Crews knew this. Every tank burned they passed was a warning. Every melted road will marked where fire had found its mark. Yet no crew doubted its importance. Strip away the turret and the Sherman lost its purpose. It became transport, cover, and little else. Firepower defined its role. Without it, the tank could not dominate ground or shield advancing men. Without it, doctrine collapsed. That belief was universal. Commanders drilled it into crews. Manuals reinforced it. Experience confirmed it in blood. A tank without a turret did not advance. It withdrew. It was written, accepted, unquestioned. Until one battlefield moment would tear that certainty apart and force an American crew to decide whether steel doctrine mattered more than survival and momentum. The first shot always came without warning. In Normandy, contact was not announced by flags or distant movement. It arrived as a crack that split the air, followed by the violent shudder of steel. 1 second the tank moved forward, engine steady, tracks biting into mud. The next, the world snapped tight around it. American Shermans pushed through narrow lanes carved between hedgerows, advancing alongside infantry from divisions that had been fighting non-stop since June. The terrain forced armor into predictable paths. German anti-tank crews knew this. They waited in silence, guns already zeroed, fingers resting on triggers. When the lead tank crossed an invisible line, the killing zone closed. A flash. A shockwave. Dirt and leaves blasted skyward. If the round struck true, armor peeled open like thin tin. If it missed, the warning was still clear. Someone had eyes on them. Radios erupted with clipped voices, overlapping reports, shouted bearings. Tank commanders ducked and rose again, trying to spot the muzzle flash before the next shot landed. Infantry scattered for cover, pressing themselves into earth that offered little protection. Riflemen fired into hedges, not knowing if they were suppressing men or shadows. Bazooka teams crawled forward, hearts pounding, knowing they had one chance to get close enough. Every movement drew fire. Every pause invited it. Inside the tank, noise overwhelmed thought. The clang of impact echoed through the hull. The gunner swung the turret toward the suspected threat, sight picture shaking as the driver lurched forward or braked hard. The loader slammed around home. The commander shouted corrections, his voice strained, his eyes burning from smoke and grit. The smell of cordite mixed with hot metal and fear. This was the moment doctrine met reality. American armor doctrine preached combined arms, coordination, and tempo. But contact stripped plans down to instinct. Crews reacted on muscle memory drilled into them through endless training. Turn. Fire. Move. Repeat. There was no room for hesitation. Anti-tank guns reloaded quickly. Panzerfaust teams waited until tanks passed, then struck from behind. The battlefield narrowed to seconds. A Sherman that stopped was a target. A Sherman that moved blindly risked mines hidden beneath churned soil. Tracks slipped in mud slicked with rain and blood. Engines screamed as drivers forced more power from overheating machines. Somewhere nearby, another tank burned, its ammunition cooking off with hollow thumps that carried across the fields. Smoke became both shield and curse. It obscured enemy positions but blinded friendly gunners. White phosphorus rounds burst against hedges, filling lanes with choking clouds. Shapes moved inside them. Friend or enemy, it was impossible to tell until someone fired. Bullets snapped past exposed heads. Shrapnel hissed like angry insects. Then came the realization that this contact was different. The incoming fire was precise. Repeated. Relentless. Someone had this section of ground mapped perfectly. The lead tank took a hit that rang deeper than before, a sound every crewman recognized. The turret lurched. The hull rocked. For a breathless moment, everything slowed. In that instant, doctrine, training, and survival collided, and the next decision would decide whether the tank lived, died, or did something no one expected. The impact came from the left, sudden and absolute. There was no warning shout, no time to brace. A sharp metallic crack tore through the tank, followed by a violence that felt less like sound and more like pressure. Steel screamed. The turret jerked violently, then lifted, not rotated, not jammed, but wrenched upward as if struck by an invisible fist. The round had hit true. An anti-tank shell, fired from close range, struck the turret ring at the worst possible angle. The explosion did not simply penetrate. It ripped. The turret, nearly 40,000 pounds of steel, gun, optics, and men, was torn from its seat. For a fraction of a second, it hovered, tilted, before slamming down at an angle against the hull. The gun barrel snapped sideways. Optics shattered. The coaxial machine gun was crushed into useless metal. Inside, the world became chaos. The concussion threw men against steel walls. One crewman was knocked unconscious. Another felt the heat of shrapnel slice past his face. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the sharp bite of burned powder. Ears rang. Vision blurred. Someone screamed, then stopped. Training said this was the end. A tank without a turret was not a tank. It was a coffin waiting to ignite. Ammunition racks sat exposed. The open ring where the turret had been sealed now gaped like a wound, letting smoke and debris pour inside. Any follow-up shot would find its mark easily. Infantry nearby scattered, certain the vehicle was finished. Outside, the battlefield did not pause. Enemy fire continued to rake the lane. Another shell struck nearby, showering the crippled Sherman with dirt and fragments. Smoke curled from the damaged hull, making it look already dead. From a distance, it was indistinguishable from the burned wrecks littering Normandy's roads. Inside the tank, seconds stretched. The commander forced himself upright, blood running into his eyes. He took in the damage with one glance. The turret was gone. The main gun was useless. Radio wires hung loose. Sunlight poured into the fighting compartment through twisted steel. Every instinct screamed to bail out. But bailing out meant climbing into a killing zone. The driver still had control. The engine still ran, coughing but alive. Tracks responded when pushed. The hull-mounted machine gun remained intact, its narrow arc suddenly the only weapon left. The crew realized, almost together, that the tank was not burning. Not yet. This was the moment doctrine ended. Every manual said abandon the vehicle. Every lesson drilled into them pointed toward survival outside the steel shell. Yet outside waited rifles, grenades, and anti-tank teams already closing in. Staying inside meant trusting damaged armor and instinct over training. The commander looked forward through cracked periscopes. The path ahead was still open, barely. Infantry were pinned down, taking fire they could not suppress alone. Retreat would expose them. Stopping would invite another shell. The tank sat at the center of the killing zone, turretless, wounded, alive. And then the driver eased the throttle forward. The tank moved again, and with that movement came a new reality. Without the turret, the Sherman was no longer sealed steel. It was open, torn, and exposed. Wind rushed into the fighting compartment, carrying smoke, dirt, and the smell of burned metal. Light poured down through the jagged opening where armor had once locked everything out. Now there was nothing between the crew and the battlefield but instinct. Every sound was sharper. Rifle fire cracked closer. Shrapnel hissed overhead and clanged against the hull. Small fragments rained down inside, bouncing off steel and flesh alike. The crew ducked low, shoulders hunched, knowing that a single grenade tossed into the open ring would end them all. The loader grabbed a carbine. The commander pulled a .45 from his chest holster. This was no longer armored warfare. This was survival inside a moving target. The driver kept the tank creeping forward, slow enough to avoid mines, fast enough to avoid being bracketed again. The engine coughed but held. Each jolt sent pain through bruised bodies. Blood mixed with sweat on faces smeared with soot. No one spoke unless necessary. Words wasted time. Time invited death. The Hull machine gun became the tank's only voice. Its narrow field of fire forced brutal precision. Short bursts hammered hedgerows and ruins where enemy shapes flickered. The gunner leaned into it, knuckles white, firing not to destroy but to keep heads down. Suppression was everything now. If the enemy paused, infantry could move. Outside, American riflemen saw what had happened and adjusted instantly. They closed in tight, using the crippled Sherman as moving cover. The tank that should have been abandoned became an anchor. Men pressed themselves against its scarred sides, boots slipping in mud churned by tracks. When the Hull gun fired, they advanced. When it stopped, they froze. Enemy fire intensified. Bullets snapped into the open compartment. One struck the rim of the turret ring and ricocheted inside, tearing through loose equipment. The commander dragged a wounded crewman lower, shielding him with his own body. There was no room to think about fear. Fear required space. There was none. The absence of the turret changed everything. No overhead protection. No rotating firepower. No commanding view. The crew fought hunched, blind to threats above waist height, trusting infantry shouts and hand signals. Every shadow felt like a man with a Panzerfaust. Every pause felt fatal. Yet the tank kept advancing. Its tracks crushed wire, debris, and fallen branches. Its bulk blocked lines of fire meant for infantry. Enemy gunners hesitated, unsure whether the wreck was dead or still dangerous. That hesitation mattered. Seconds mattered. In war, seconds decided who lived to take the next step. The commander glanced forward through cracked optics. Smoke thinned briefly, revealing ground not yet taken. It was only a few dozen yards, but it might as well have been miles. Beyond it waited either cover or annihilation. Retreat was still possible, but the infantry behind them had no cover if the tank turned back. The Sherman rolled on, exposed men inside open steel, daring the battlefield to finish what the shell had started. And the battlefield prepared to answer. The order never came. No radio call crackled through the damaged set telling them to fall back. No flare marked a withdrawal line. In the smoke and noise of the killing zone, the decision rested entirely inside the shattered hull of one American tank. Retreat was the safe choice on paper. Doctrine demanded it. A turretless Sherman was combat ineffective, a liability to itself and others. Turning back meant survival, at least a chance at it. But retreat also meant exposing the infantry clustered behind the tank. It meant backing down a narrow lane already mapped by enemy guns. It meant turning a wounded machine into a slow, predictable target. The commander weighed those seconds with brutal clarity. His men were hurt but alive. The engine still answered the throttle. The Hull gun still fired. Ahead, the ground dipped slightly, offering the promise of cover if they could reach it. Behind them, riflemen were pinned, pressed flat by fire they could not return alone. He did not shout. There was no speech, no drama. He leaned forward and tapped the driver's shoulder twice. Advance. The driver pushed the throttle in, teeth clenched. The tank lurched forward, tracks grinding, metal screaming in protest. Every foot gained felt stolen from death. The exposed crew flinched as rounds snapped overhead. One burst tore through the open compartment, punching holes through loose gear. No one stopped moving. Enemy gunners hesitated. A tank advancing without a turret made no sense. It looked dead, yet it moved with intent. That hesitation broke the rhythm of their fire. Infantry seized it. They rose and ran in short bursts, boots slipping in mud, rifles tight against shoulders. Shouts cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. The tank became a decision point on the battlefield. Its movements signaled intent to everyone watching. American troops pushed. Enemy positions shifted, unsure whether to focus on the crippled armor or the men advancing behind it. In war, confusion was a weapon. The turretless Sherman wielded it without firing a single shell. Inside, the crew worked like men already written off. Pain dulled into background noise. Fear narrowed into focus. The commander tracked movement through shattered optics. The hull gun fired in disciplined bursts, stitching the edge of a hedgerow where enemy silhouettes had appeared seconds earlier. Each burst bought a few more yards. The tank crossed into the shallow dip. Fire slackened, just enough. Infantry poured past the flanks, spreading out, taking positions that had been unreachable moments before. The ground changed hands not because of firepower, but because of refusal. Retreat would have been reasonable. Advance was reckless. But war did not reward reason. It rewarded momentum seized at the edge of disaster. The turretless Sherman rolled on, not because it was strong, but because stopping would have broken everything around it. As the smoke shifted and the noise changed, the crew realized they had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer reacting. They were leading. And somewhere ahead, unseen eyes adjusted their aim, preparing to punish that decision. The advance did not slow. If anything, it became more deliberate, more dangerous. Enemy fire adjusted, snapping tighter around the moving tank. Machine gun rounds stitched the ground ahead, kicking mud into the air. Mortar rounds fell closer now, dull thumps that shook the earth and rattled exposed steel. The Sherman rolled through it all, turretless, scarred, unmistakably alive. The crew felt every hit. Without the turret, there was no illusion of protection. Bullets cracked against the hull and whined overhead, passing through open space where armor had once sealed them in. One round punched through the lip of the fighting compartment and vanished into the engine block, sending a sharp hiss of escaping steam into the air. The driver flinched but kept moving. Stopping meant death. Everyone knew it. The hull machine gun chattered again, short bursts fired with restraint. Ammunition was limited. Every round had to matter. The gunner aimed low, sweeping likely firing points, forcing enemy heads down long enough for infantry to move. American riflemen advanced in staggered bounds, dropping, firing, then pushing forward again. The damaged tank set their rhythm. As long as it moved, they moved. Smoke thickened, mixing cordite and earth into a choking fog. Visibility dropped to yards. Shapes appeared and vanished without warning. A Panzerfaust team broke cover on the right, sprinting toward the lane. The commander shouted, pointing. The hull gun swung and fired, tearing into the hedgerow, leaves and branches exploding outward. The threat disappeared back into shadow. The Sherman crossed ground no one expected it to reach. Its tracks chewed through debris and shattered fencing, the weight of the hull collapsing cover meant to stop men, not armor. Enemy fire faltered again, unsure how to respond to a tank that refused to die. Confusion rippled outward. Positions meant to hold were abandoned. Others opened fire too late. Inside, the crew operated on instinct alone. Hands moved without conscious thought. Pain faded behind adrenaline. Sweat streamed down faces streaked with grime. The open sky above the fighting compartment felt unreal, as if they were fighting inside a broken shell rather than a machine built for war. Yet the engine still growled beneath them, steady and defiant. An explosion rocked the ground ahead, throwing dirt and smoke across the tank's path. The driver steered through it, trusting the ground beneath his tracks. A mine could have ended everything. So could a well-placed shell. None came. Luck, timing, and audacity held together by inches. Infantry reached the next hedgerow and took it. Grenades detonated. Rifles cracked. Shouts echoed through smoke as American soldiers poured into positions that had been enemy strongpoints moments before. The turretless Sherman rolled up beside them, its scarred hull looming like a shield. Men slapped its sides as they passed, quick acknowledgments that said more than words. The impossible advance had become reality. Ground was gained. Fire slackened. For the first time since the hit, there was space to breathe. But breathing did not mean safety. Enemy artillery could still answer. Anti-tank guns could still realign. The tank had proven it could advance without a turret. What it had not proven was whether it could survive what came next. The shock spread faster than smoke. An American tank, stripped of its turret, still moving with purpose, cut through expectations on both sides of the line. For the enemy, it shattered assumptions drilled into them by experience. A tank without a turret was dead. This one was not. That single contradiction bent the fight in ways no artillery barrage could. Enemy fire slackened, not from lack of will, but from hesitation. Gunners adjusted their sights twice, unsure whether to prioritize the advancing infantry or the crippled armor that refused to fall back. That pause, measured in heartbeats, was lethal. American riflemen exploited it immediately, surging into ground that moments earlier had been a killing zone. The battlefield's rhythm broke, then reset, this time favoring momentum instead of control. Officers along the line noticed. Hand signals changed. Squads shifted axes of advance, angling toward positions the tank's movement had exposed. The turretless Sherman became a moving reference point, its scarred hull signaling where pressure could be applied safely, where the enemy line had cracked. War was not just firepower. It was perception. And perception had shifted. Inside the tank, the crew felt the change without fully understanding it. Incoming fire became sporadic rather than constant. The air, while still thick with smoke, felt less suffocating. The commander lifted his head slightly higher, scanning ground now visible through thinning haze. Infantry moved with more confidence, their shouts sharper, their movements faster. The tank had done more than survive. It had altered the flow. The enemy responded with desperation. Mortars fell in a wider pattern, less precise. Machine gun nests opened up prematurely, revealing positions that had remained hidden before. Suppressive fire answered them instantly. Grenades followed. What had been a disciplined defense dissolved into fragmented resistance, each pocket fighting alone. The turretless Sherman rolled forward another few yards, then paused. Not from damage, but from calculation. The crew listened. Counted seconds. Watched infantry fan out and establish positions. The hull gun fired short, controlled bursts, less to kill than to remind the enemy that the tank still mattered. It still commanded space. Across the field, burned-out armor and shattered hedgerows bore silent witness to how the fight had been expected to go. Those expectations no longer applied. A machine that should have withdrawn had advanced instead, and that defiance rippled outward. American troops pushed harder, believing the impossible had already happened. The enemy pulled back in places they had sworn to hold. This was shock, not in the explosive sense, but in the way it disrupted certainty. Doctrine failed. Experience faltered. The battlefield became fluid, unpredictable. For a brief window, advantage belonged to the side willing to exploit confusion rather than fear it. The tank crew felt the weight of that window. Their vehicle was still vulnerable. Ammunition was low. Wounds still bled. The enemy would adapt. They always did. Artillery observers would recalibrate. Anti-tank guns would realign. The shock would fade. But in that narrow slice of time, the turretless Sherman had forced a recalculation across the line. It had proven that momentum could be manufactured from wreckage. That audacity could replace armor. That the fight was no longer bound by what should have happened. And as the smoke drifted and guns fell briefly silent, a new danger gathered beyond the next line, ready to answer the shock with overwhelming force. When the firing finally thinned, the battlefield looked unfamiliar. Smoke drifted low across torn hedgerows. Burned-out vehicles smoldered quietly, their metal ticking as it cooled. The turretless Sherman sat where it had no right to be, engine idling unevenly, scarred and open to the sky. For the first time since the hit, there was space to think. The crew stayed inside longer than necessary. Adrenaline lingered, sharp and brittle. Hands trembled as weapons were lowered. The commander scanned the ground slowly now, no longer hunting muzzle flashes but measuring what had changed. American infantry occupied positions that had been enemy strongpoints an hour earlier. Wounded men were being pulled back. Ammunition crates were dragged forward. The line had moved. Only then did the weight of it settle in. Against every rule, they had kept going. Not blindly, not recklessly, but with purpose shaped by necessity. They had used a crippled machine as leverage, turning vulnerability into pressure. The tank had not destroyed enemy positions with firepower. It had done something more subtle. It had forced choices. It had denied the enemy certainty. Officers arrived, ducking under the open ring, staring at the damage in disbelief. The missing turret spoke louder than any report. Questions came, brief and sharp. How far had they gone? Under what fire? Why hadn't they withdrawn? The answers were simple and insufficient. Because stopping meant death. Because infantry needed cover. Because the engine still ran. Medics treated the wounded crewmen where they sat, working quickly, efficiently. Blood was wiped away. Bandages tightened. No one spoke of heroics. No one framed it as bravery. It felt closer to obligation carried past its expected end. The tank was inspected and finally declared combat ineffective. Its advance was over. Recovery crews would deal with it later if it survived the night. Orders filtered down for the unit to prepare for the next push. War did not pause for reflection. It consumed results and demanded more. Yet word spread anyway. Soldiers spoke quietly about the tank without a turret that kept moving. About how it had drawn fire. About how it had given them the seconds they needed. Stories grew as they traveled, shaped by shock and relief. The truth sat somewhere in the middle, less dramatic and more unsettling. A crew had crossed a line they were never meant to cross, and the battlefield had rewarded it. The men climbed out at last, boots hitting mud, legs unsteady. They stood beside their machine, seeing it now from the outside. The torn steel. The exposed interior. The absence where power had once lived. It should have been a grave. Instead, it was proof. They understood what they had done without needing it explained. They had advanced when retreat was expected. They had forced momentum from wreckage. They had altered a fight not through overwhelming strength, but through refusal to break. The sound of distant guns reminded them that the war was not finished. What they had done would not end it. It might not even be remembered beyond this sector. But in this place, on this day, the impossible had held. And as the next barrage began to assemble beyond the horizon, the question lingered: how long before the battlefield demanded something just as unforgiving again? Long after the tank was written off and towed from the line, its mark remained. Not in reports or citations, but in the way men talked about that day. In the way officers adjusted expectations. In the quiet understanding that war was not governed solely by equipment tables and field manuals. It was governed by people forced to decide when rules no longer fit the moment. The Sherman had been designed around armor, firepower, and doctrine. Lose the turret and it lost its reason to exist. That was the assumption built into every training manual issued in 1944. Yet the battlefield had exposed a gap between theory and reality. In that gap, human judgment mattered more than steel thickness or gun caliber. What the tank proved was not that machines could fight without their essential parts. It proved that momentum could replace firepower when used at the right instant. The crew had not advanced because they believed themselves invincible. They advanced because the alternative guaranteed collapse of their position, of the infantry relying on them, of the narrow chance they still possessed. This was not heroism in the cinematic sense. There was no charge, no triumph. There was only refusal. Refusal to accept that damage equaled defeat. Refusal to retreat into a killing zone already measured by the enemy. That refusal disrupted expectations on both sides, and disruption, even briefly, reshaped the fight. Across the Western Front, countless tanks were lost exactly as doctrine predicted. Most turretless machines never moved again. This one did, and in doing so, revealed an uncomfortable truth about war. Outcomes were not always dictated by superiority. Sometimes they were decided by the side willing to press forward when logic insisted otherwise. The crew would move on. Reassigned, replaced, absorbed back into the vast machinery of the American Army. Their names might never appear in books or documentaries. The tank itself would be scrapped or cannibalized for parts. Steel returned to steel. The moment would fade. But the lesson endured in fragments. In after-action reviews that noted unexpected resistance. In infantry officers who remembered how movement, not firepower, had opened the line. In tankers who understood that doctrine was guidance, not law. The battlefield that day did not reward recklessness. It rewarded timing. The advance worked because it happened at the precise moment the enemy expected withdrawal. Because hesitation on one side created opportunity on the other. Because a broken machine, used decisively, became a weapon of shock rather than force. This tank proved that war was more than armor and guns. It was perception under pressure. It was decisions made in seconds that carried consequences for hours. It was the thin margin between collapse and progress, crossed not by strength alone, but by will. As the front moved east and the war ground on toward its brutal conclusion, moments like this accumulated quietly. Not enough to change history on their own, but enough to shape how it unfolded, yard by yard, decision by decision. And somewhere ahead, beyond maps and plans, another crew would face a moment just as unforgiving where doctrine would fall silent, and only judgment would remain.